Hello and welcome back to Searching for Reality. Here we are, still here, still searching, and we are going to embark on the last two modules, or the last 2 weeks of this course. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago during one of our Zoom sessions, I was going to sort of reorganize the last few weeks of the material. So here we are now with week 12. And I think what's left is really going to work well together, because what I did is I put together Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud together. On the surface, they don't appear to be really covering similar ground. But when you look a little bit deeper, what they do is rather explosive, which is to say that Charles Darwin, with his theory of evolution, basically destroys the notion of metaphysical perfection and some sort of timeless prototype that Plato would have talked about that somehow is eternal and ahistorical. The theory of evolution destroys that very concept. The other thing that Darwin does is he also questions and renders rather problematic Aristotle's idea of a teleological endpoint. And what that means is the notion that a thing or a person, specifically a person, if we're talking about Aristotle, has a kind of endpoint. They finish in the most perfect version of themselves. Well, the theory of evolution, the very word evolution, indicates that that's not the case, that we're constantly reprogramming ourselves, as it were, and adapting to our environment. And if we can do that, we will continue to survive. It is the way in which we are able to adapt that allows us to continue to evolve and to grow and to develop. If that's the case, then teleology becomes a very problematic idea. So that's the one thing about Darwin that is really important in this course. The other is Sigmund Freud, who is considered to be the father of psychoanalysis. And this is a field that really came into being at the very beginning of the last century, the beginning of the 20th century. And what Freud does, much like Darwin, is he explodes another idea that had been around for, well, essentially 2,500 years, right? Which is this notion of rationality, of reason. And let's face it, every single philosopher that we've looked at and talked about always privileged the idea of reason and rationality. Freud comes along and basically from underneath destroys that concept by presenting to us this notion of the unconscious, of these id-like desires and prejudices and strengths and drives and all these things that essentially render problematic the notion of reason. We cannot be reasonable creatures if we at the same time are fighting and struggling against these desires and ideas that well up from beneath us and influence our way of thinking. And so what Freud does is he turns rationality on its head and for the first time presents to us other forces that are at work to render us not thinking as clearly as we think we used to. So both of these thinkers are very, very important. Very briefly, next week in week 13, or module 13, we're going to be looking at postmodernism and the construction of gender. The section that will be taken out is a section on John Rawls, which was a kind of a bonus section. But we don't even have the week to devote to John Rawls and his theory of justice and fairness. It's interesting. You can take a look at it because it is still there. But right now, let's focus on Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud and begin to try to make sense of what it was that, in this case, Darwin was talking about. So you can see Darwin lived during the 1800s, basically throughout the entire 1800s, 1809 to 1882. And Darwin was not an archaeologist or anthropologist or physician or anything, but he was a natural scientist, right? He was really involved with the world around him, and more importantly, the natural environment, animals and flora and fauna, things growing and evolving. And so his historical place is in proposing what he called the theory of evolution, and the notion that we descend from a common stock. And not only does the theory of evolution posit for the first time the possibility that we may have evolved from apes, sharing in a sense the same gene pool, but because of where we end up living and the particular challenges that each of these sort of natural beings are confronted with, we begin to develop differently, and we evolve from apes with an opposable thumb, the sort of larger hands, a larger brain and language, and with language and the hand and the opposable thumbs, we just keep evolving. So Darwin is the first one to present to us this possibility, this idea of a theory of evolution, that we have evolved from something else, that we were not placed on this earth fully formed. And of course, this is an idea that's presented often in religion, that the Garden of Eden, we have Adam and Eve fully formed as human beings. The only thing they're not born with is shame. Shame is something that they learn once they realize what they have done, and they are driven out of the Garden of Eden. So this is not the same thing. Theory of evolution posits instead the possibility that we have evolved from an animal, or animals, in this case from apes. But it also is a possible way to explain biodiversity, why there are ranges of human beings, why we look different around the world, and in the same way, why animals look very different around the world. Whether we talk about an ape, or a bird, or a dog, or a cat, or any of these kinds of things, biodiversity is something that exists in nature, right? It's a real thing. But it wasn't until Darwin that we had at least a possibility to explain what this was. So generally speaking, Darwin's idea is that the cumulative effects of small changes between generations, now these are very small changes over a very long period of time. This is not happening overnight or a weekend. These are incremental changes that happen over hundreds, thousands and thousands of years. And they do occur between generations. And the end result is what he calls speciation. And speciation is what we're going to look at next. Okay, so we talked about the idea of a cumulative effect, right? These small changes that are passed on through inheritance. So small inheritable changes between generations, and coupled with these sort of reproductive successes. And what that means is certain of these changes do not carry on, right? The gene sort of exhausts itself and just dies out, which is to say that at one point we may have been covered in hair, and over many, many generations, eventually we ended up with less and less hair on our body. At one point we may have had a tail. We call it tailbone, something, a part of our anatomy. All these things occur over, first of all, a very, very long period of time. And secondly, those small heritable changes sometimes are not passed on through hereditary traits. Sometimes they simply die off. So what happens with speciation is when the population evolves and diverges to become distinct species. So speciation is where that split occurs. And it isn't just various forms of apes, right? All of a sudden, we have Cro-Magnon man, or we have an early version of the Homo sapien. So speciation is when that population evolves to the point where we end up having distinct species. So humans and chimpanzees can share recent common ancestry, but they diverge, they separate, they split apart at one point. And then you have finally chimpanzees and apes and so on that live in the modern day and look a certain way. And then we have Homo sapiens, which are us. But at one point, yes, we shared the same genetic pool, and speciation over a very, very long time allowed us to devolve away, to diverge away from a pure ape. And again, those kinds of terms like the essence and the purity of something, always put that in quotations. Because if Darwin is correct, it is an evolving process. At no point does something become a finished product. So it's never that teleological endpoint that Aristotle would have talked about. It's instead a constant evolution. So at one point, speciation allows for that species to split, right? To become two separate things. And then, of course, those two separate things, they continue to evolve. And eventually we end up with what we have today, where we have a Homo sapiens and we have chimpanzees. Now, these small changes, yes, they do occur. Some continue to live on because they are useful and they become part of that DNA of that particular species. And what happens is the individual monkey or Homo sapien or chimpanzee, whatever, what matters is that population can continue to procreate. Because if that species cannot procreate, then it dies off. The entire species will die off. Now, this is before we show up and pollute the air and the water and the ground, and we keep putting up buildings further and further into the forest. We're not talking about that. We're talking about natural selection. And natural selection at this point here is that not only are these small changes occurring, some dying out, some staying on, but that species can continue to reproduce. And as long as they can, then those small changes will carry on into the next generation. And so that is really, really what is important, is the fact that these changes can be carried on through procreation and they continue to exist. So you have, on the one hand, this continual generational change that occurs. And of course, it's never a static thing. It's always an ongoing process. And over the next few thousand or hundreds of thousands of years, we don't know what we're going to look like. First of all, I hope we're going to be around, but we don't know eventually what we're going to look like. It depends on what natural events are occurring around us. If, for example, climate change occurs and the sun gets hotter, well, many people may die off, but the ones that survive may actually have a change in their genes that allow them to have either darker skin or thicker skin or some protection from the sun. So that next generation, right, that small heritable change is going to be something that is beneficial. And if it isn't, that's why certain species will die off. So speciation occurs when a breeding population, a population that can continue to reproduce, splits into two different species. Now, this can happen for a whole range of reasons. We know, for example, that if we talk to geologists, that at one point the Earth was believed to have been one giant chunk of land. Now, still on a round globe, right, with water everywhere, but over hundreds of thousands of years, these kind of tectonic plates begin to shift apart. And eventually we have, because if you look at South America and Europe, or South America and Africa, and you were to bring them together, they kind of fit, right? In a weird way, like a jigsaw puzzle, they kind of fit together, because where one piece of land juts out, there's another section missing almost in the other landmass. And what I'm getting at here is, not only were the species changing, but even the geographical places where they found themselves would often change. And what that means is, over hundreds of thousands of years, if not even millions, as these geographical locations began to change and the surrounding area, the environment became, warmer or colder, those things would also impact on the genetic makeup of those individuals. So it's a remarkable view of the world and the development of the world in terms of us as animals and as human beings responding to our environment. So those genetic changes, right, between the populations increase what they call the phenotypic variations. Now, don't worry about these fancy words. They're not going to be in the test, but it's nice to know what they are. But phenotypic variations, physiology, behavior, morphology, physiology for sure, because if, for example, because of the shifting of tectonic plates over hundreds of thousands of years, means that one area becomes hotter or colder than another, or rockier, or just the terrain is more difficult, all these things are going to affect the genetic pool that is responsible for the species that is alive in that particular area. Now, if it is too harsh, then guess what? The entire species dies off. And this is what we have, for example, with dinosaurs. We have a type of animal that just didn't survive for any number of reasons. Now, that's not what we're talking about here, mostly because I don't really know a whole lot of theory about dinosaurs other than possible meteors or something happened. But the point is, at a certain time in history, it became impossible for dinosaurs to continue to exist, and they died off. We, for some reason, were lucky enough because we either learned to find shelter, we learned to to cook food. There's just the idea of cooking food would be absolutely remarkable, because now all of a sudden your palate is much more widened from just eating plants. So you go from a plant-based diet to a plant and meat-based diet, and that of course will affect your physiology and your morphology as well. But all these kinds of things all go together to at least help us to explain the way that Darwin does how we evolve into the species that we have today. Now, let's also be clear on what evolution isn't. And what it isn't is abiogenesis, right? That is a theory of life's origins. And these would be things like the Big Bang theory. And again, this is a whole other realm of speculative physics and so on, rather than, natural physics, which is more the realm that we're in right now. And so Darwin is looking to try to figure out not how we came into being, but how we continued to evolve. So when we talk about the origin of species, it's not about the origin of human beings. It's not the origin of animals. It's the origins of species. How we as Homo sapien, right, human beings, evolved from animals, or in this case, evolved from apes. So it's not an origin of how the apes came into being, but how we developed from that into something else. Or how there is such a wide variety of birds, such a wide variety of just animals, right? Of all kinds of animals. So let's be clear on that. It's not about how we came into being as much as how we came into being as a species. So that is very important, because we're talking about the diversity of life, that we know that there is life, but we're not in the position, as certainly Darwin was not in the position, to begin to try to tackle that much more substantial issue. So we're talking about the origins of species, how we as Homo sapien came into being out of a genetic pool that at one point also included apes and sort of marsupials and so on, that, animals that only kind of remotely look like us, but we know at some point we shared a common gene pool. So this is what Darwin was looking at. How did that gene pool evolve into the species that we recognize today? So it's not a system of belief in the sense that it attempts to explain everything, specifically the Big Bang theory, how the first moment of life came into being, the origins of life, the meaning of life. Meaning of life, that's philosophy and religion. Origins of life, that could also be religion if you are a believer and you believe that this all came into being through the incredible wisdom and gifts of God. That's the meaning of life, but that's also philosophy, origins of life. All these things kind of belong in other fields, especially when we're thinking about Darwin and how he at least presents to us a possible idea that refers to the origins of species. So evolution-like mechanisms might have played a role in abiogenesis, but really what we are looking at with Darwin is how life today evolves from life prior. That's really the genesis of his work. Okay, so when we talk about evolution, we have evolution as a fact and as a possible theory, because there are some people that don't buy this at all, and they are creationists. And they believe that the Earth has been around for, I believe, 6,400 years, even though we have dinosaur bones that date back to a couple of million years ago. So it is a theory for some people, or may not even be that for certain people. But let's sort of suspend our disbelief and look at the theory of evolution, the origin of species, as a fact and as a theory. So there is a fact of evolution, and then there's a theory, right? There's two simple things, or two straightforward things. And so it is a fact, right, that evolution occurs. We are able to see it because we were able to see the wide selection, right? All the different species that are on the earth. So this is one thing that can at least allow us to say, okay, the end result presently, right, because this is an ongoing process, presently looks like the following. This is what the origin of the species looks like. So that will be the fact. So the theory of evolution, on the other hand, it presents this kind of framework where the fact, of evolution can sort of now be explained. So the theory is, okay, here are the facts, here are the species that we know exist. We believe that we evolved from apes, and so here's the theory behind it. If this is the fact that we can see, because the ability for apes to learn language, even sign language, is a remarkable thing. They are. We look at them. We can sense that we are both very similar yet very different from one another. But at one point, again, we share that same gene pool. So the theory is a framework within which the facts begin to make sense. That's really what's happening. Especially the idea of natural selection, origin of species, the notion of evolution. All these things begin to make sense when we apply the theory that Darwin is presenting for us. So heritability and selection, these things are important. Mutation as well. All of these things are all about the fact that these particular traits, right? These, for some reason, all of a sudden, doop, right? Something just happens in the gene pool. Suddenly, there's just a quickening in the gene pool that responds to a persistent geographical change or climate change or something that's occurring exterior of the body. And it's there in such a consistent way that the gene pool begins to mutate a little bit. It responds to it. And that response, right, becomes that heritability aspect, right? It can be inherited onto the next, onto the next generation. So these traits are passed down, especially the ones that are important. The ones that are important are the ones that allow us to continue to survive. So the ones that are not so important, eye color, hair color, they're there. And so, you might have 3 family members, 2 with blue eyes, 1 with green eyes. It's not important. People will or will not survive depending on the eye color or hair color. But an ability to survive extreme temperatures, that's something that allows not only that person to continue to exist and survive, but very likely pass that on to the next generation. So when we talk about the mutation of the gene pool, the selective, sort of the way in which certain genes are selected over others as being more important, all that is all about those traits being passed down and individuals becoming more resilient, more able to live in a certain climate. So those kinds of things are occurring all the time. Now, that transmission is not always perfect. The codes can kind of bounce around, and there could be glitches, and there could be, there are birth defects that happen all the time still today. It's just something that cannot be controlled, because the magic of the beginning of life is just that. There are parts that, well, sure, we can explain it, but we say, there it is. Under those conditions, under that certain temperature, that certain alchemic, response of some sort, suddenly the sperm and the egg meet together, and the next thing you know, life starts. So that transmission is not always perfect. We can have birth defects, and we know this is what happens. This is not a sign from God. This is not a sign from the devil either. It's a birth defect. That transmission was not perfect. And so there are different different mutations that will continue to survive, and others simply will die out. If the change is not important, again, in the sense that it will allow that species to not only continue to survive, but also to procreate, then obviously it's going to continue. But it's never perfect. We need to remember and remind ourselves of that as long as the change is net positive, if it's a bird, like it says right here, a slightly thicker beak, a longer neck, anything that allows the animal to continue to survive and survive more effectively, those are the mutations which will become part of the new gene pool and will be passed on to the next generation. So if this is occurring, then the species will very likely be able to continue to survive. So this is all part of what we see happening over hundreds of thousands of years. This is not even happening over a few hundred years. it takes many, many thousands of generations before these small incremental changes occur. So those different changes are not created, or it's not a sudden leap. These are very small, very gradual, almost imperceptible changes. But when we look at what we could call the beginnings, and again, the beginnings with an apes, or an ape can go even before that compared to us now. But we can see that there was this at one point and then that now, right? Two utterly different species. And so that genetic encoding does take a very long time. And sometimes they are very good. Other times, maybe they are not so good. But the mutation will last for a period of time. And eventually, if it is not a useful one, it will just simply die off. But again, over hundreds of thousands of years. Now, again, you can take a look at some of these links here. This mutation of a fruit fly, you can take a look at that. Because, I mean, this is really interesting stuff, to say the least. But it certainly allows us to look at the world in a rather unique way that was not possible, let's say, 300 years ago, or at least prior to Darwin. So these small changes over a very, very long time eventually do allow these species to divide up and to become radically different from one another. Imagine, just think of all the different kinds of birds, right? A tiny little sparrow, a blue jay, a pelican. I mean, they're all birds, right? Because they've got wings and so on, and they've got beaks, but they look so different. And the reason why they look so different is because they have all evolved under different climatic or geographical conditions. And those things do occur. So speciation is responsible for that. So those things, those external elements, those external influences over very long periods of time allow for speciation, which is, again, the dividing up into two distinct things what was originally one. So again, to stay with the example of apes to Homo sapiens, at one point we have apes, then we have that first speciation split from apes to kind of the Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal man, all the different sort of cavemen over a very long period of time. And then eventually we end up with a Homo sapien as we recognize them today. And so that process, again, takes a very long time, but it also needs to be continued by a population that can continue to procreate. Without that, that genetic pool just dies out, right? It's just no longer there. It simply doesn't exist. Okay, so speciation is probably one of the most important ideas within Darwin, because the origin of species is in itself what's important. But the ideas of speciation we're going to take a look at here. There is always the possibility of an incomplete speciation where there is a split, and then the split is now going to not last forever because of a range of different reasons. But here already, we're starting to see sort of challenges to long-held ideas. And in this case, the notion of some kind of perfection, right? These Platonic forms, because Plato, as we remember, at the beginning of this term, that we have these ideal forms, these perfect forms that exist in our minds, and they are ahistorical, they are eternal, they are perfect in every way, and yet along comes Darwin and says, hold on, not so fast. So this little ring species, I am not a geneticist and I'm not a natural scientist. I am a philosopher by trade. So I will just sort of present that here for you, but certainly have a look at it, this idea of a ring species. So you have animals that are nearby, right? They're geographically neighbors. And so you've got sort of different animals, right? The different species that may interbreed. And this would indicate that they are the same species despite some sort of generic differences. And the members of the population near the end of this territorial spread are incapable of breeding because now the change is so radical that either the sexual organs don't fit together, or there is, for some reason, the inability to get the procreative, let's say we'll call it the sperm, inside the female in some way because of any number of reasons. And then what happens is we end up with this, right? These changes all the way along because you can see them moving in both directions. And then eventually what will happen is one of the two species will not be able to procreate with the other any longer. And again, this is happening over hundreds of thousands of years, not over even 100 years or even 1,000. But that break, that ring cycle that gets broken is because at one point they are no longer able to procreate. This is such a crucial aspect of this whole idea that without the ability to pass on these traits, these genetic changes, then the species will die out. Now, luckily, in our case, we have not, and that's why we are still here, because we continue to be able to procreate. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, we have the issue of this Platonic idea, this metaphysical idea of perfect forms and perfect ideas that are ahistorical and are timeless. And now all of a sudden, we can sort of rethink that, because one of the things about Darwin's idea is this notion of what is constituted as an essential trait. Because if things are constantly evolving and changing, now again, we are talking about millions of years, first of all, or at least let's say a couple of million years. I think again we've some dinosaur bones in the belief that the Earth has been around for about 4 billion years. That's a huge amount of time. So let's say we're able to look at this timeline. It's massive, of course. But let's say just take a 2 billion chunk. We can see that there is constant evolution, and not only evolution, but splitting off into different species. Now, if that's the case, then the idea of essentialism is rendered problematic, because if essentialism is that innate trait, right, that unchanging, immutable, because immutable means change, right, unchanging trait, what happens to that? That goes out the window. Because if we are constantly in a state of evolution, we are constantly a process and not a product, then clearly, yes, today and over the next 500 or 1,000 years, we're all going to look generally the same, which is why we can look at art from 1,000 years ago and we can recognize ourselves. But when we look at sort of drawings that artists have rendered of what a Cro-Magnon man may have looked like, or Neanderthal man, suddenly now we don't look slightly as much the same. There's some clear differences here. The brow or the high forehead, just the musculature. We look kind of the same, but that's going back again 1 million years. So essentialism becomes problematic because we can't say that something is immutable and unchanging. It's quite the opposite. Darwin says, no, it's exactly the opposite that's going on. So essentially, that's what Darwin is doing, right? He's challenging this idea of an essential, immutable thingness about individuals and about animals and species, because these continual gradual changes over a period of time means that there are no sort of immutable markers, right? Immutable traits of an animal that is going to be consistent from, let's say, 4 million years ago to now. No, because we are constantly changing. So humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, everything else. Well, 5 to 7 million years ago is the belief that that's when we split off. And at that point, again, there was maybe some essential feature, but clearly the word no longer works when we're talking about the natural world, because we can say that at a given time, there may be some immutable, unchanging traits. But if we're honest with ourselves, no, they're constantly undergoing change. So that's the one thing. So we got Plato's ideal forms thrown out the window, essentialism rendered problematic, and the last one here is an attack on teleology. Now, Darwin isn't out to specifically and consciously attack teleology. That was not what he was trying to do, but the result of his work, the theory that informs his work, now renders problematic these philosophical concepts that we've had, right? Metaphysical perfection and teleology, essentialism. But this is kind of the spin-off, the runoff from Darwin's thinking, is that evolution, as it is presented to us by Darwin, Okay, evolution is no distinct aim, right? It doesn't go towards higher complexity. It just keeps on going. It just doesn't stop. And if it does stop, it's because there's some kind of state of perfection, we'll say, that is not allowing the genes to respond in any significant way. Everything is sort of reached a kind of like a stalemate of some sort of, or a stillness. But let's face it, that never happened. This never stays for very long. I mean, we're facing some tremendously important and dangerous, natural catastrophes on this earth. I mean, we are seriously talking about possibly not even being here in the next few hundred years, which should be terrifying. And if that's the case, are we going to survive? So that higher complexity, higher level of intelligence, higher level of consciousness, yeah, sure, that would be nice, but we don't know. So the idea that, higher and better forms of intelligent life, that would be great. But we don't know whether that is going to be what matters in the future. Maybe just pure brute strength. Maybe the ability to grip something with larger and larger hands. Maybe that will be the more important thing. So this notion of a teleological endpoint, which is, self-consciousness, for example, if you're a philosopher, that's kind of up in the air. We're not sure. I mean, that could be what happens. We'd have to wait and see. So probably the biggest issue with Darwin is certainly the religious response to his ideas. And so is there a conflict? Well, it depends how you look at it. Because the answer to that is, just like a good philosopher, yes and no. And so let's look at that. All right, yes, only as much as some theological arguments explicitly claim that the complexity of the natural world could only could be counted by a supernatural agency. Okay, so this is simply the idea that, and we've talked about this, whether we were talking about Spinoza, we were talking about Saint Alsam, Thomas Aquinas, everyone that was presenting the idea of a kind of beautiful design to nature. These arguments would always rely on the notion of a godhead, of a spiritual force that creates this world. And what Darwin does, he doesn't destroy that, but he presents a theory called evolution as an alternative, right? As a different way to look at this process, this tremendous beauty of the natural world, of the physiological world, the world of animals, as well as the world of plants and so on. So that's not the same as talking about the beginnings of life itself, which is abiogenesis. So those things are still there, and certainly religion is one way to define it and explain it and rationalize it. So that's why evolution is not it hasn't killed religion. It has simply presented an alternative. Now, there is always the possibility that in God's infinite design, that evolution was one of the designs. So if that's the case, evolution and religious thought sit very well together. So it really depends on how you want to look at it. You can look at it that, okay, I believe the Bible, and the Bible says that 6,400 years ago, the world came into being. Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden. Eve ate of the apple. Both were turfed out of the Garden of Eden, and off we went. And so the issue here is, okay, if God had designed evolution into these natural laws, laws of nature, because the natural laws are based on reason, but laws of nature. If evolution is one of those laws of nature, then both can coexist without any problems. So it really depends how we look at it. Now, is there an issue ultimately between science and religion? And once again, yes or no, right? Depends on which position you take. So when we talk about atheism, which is a belief in no God whatsoever, theism, which is a belief in monotheism, a single God, compare that also to deism, right? An impersonal God that is more like a watchmaker that winds up the world, including evolution maybe, and lets it go. These are sort of metaphysical positions. And so science doesn't, the business of science is not to try to refute atheism and theism. It can be used as a tool, but the goal of science is to help to explain the world, for us to be able to understand it. So if there is a conflict between science and religion, right, it's really according to a set of arguments that talk about evidence, right? If those arguments talk about evidence for theism or deism, that's fine. But science and religion can still coexist, because science is, the goal of science is not to destroy religion, it's to simply understand the world. And if the world can be understood, and we can still say, look, we've discovered this remarkable thing called evolution, and that could be part of God's plan. You're back to square one and nothing is wrong. So it really depends on how you wish to look at it. Now, the only time it is kind of a problem is when you look at it as, the only way to explain this is the existence of God or some spiritual force, if you wish to be a Spinozist. And when you have an argument such as the following here, X can only be explained by appealing to X, therefore X must exist, appealing to Y, then Y must exist. Well, of course, Y would be God, right? X is the natural world and all of the laws of nature that follow suit. When you are trying to justify an argument by relying on Y, and that you cannot prove, then it is not a solid foundation. It's more like something like Kierkegaard I talked about last week. It's a leap to faith. We simply say, well, reason can only take me this far, so I will just make that final leap into faith and say, it is what it is. So empirical science, right? It does conflict with this argument, because empirical science is trying to replace Y with something else. Maybe trying to replace Y, if that were God, with simply understanding and defining and identifying the various laws of nature that allow nature to continue. And so, again, this is what Darwin is essentially doing. He's presenting to us a new way of looking at the world that is not relying on an argument that needs a figure or an idea that cannot be proven conclusively. Because when we're doing that, eventually that's what is happening, right? You are making this premise that you have to ultimately believe before you can even try to prove it. Because if Y is God, then you have to prove that. Well, how about if we just simply say science will be Y, and science will be those natural, right, those laws of nature, should say, that are there. So when we finally end up looking at Darwin sort of from a macro view, we know that since Darwin, many of the ideas that he has presented to us have been confirmed to a certain degree by DNA, molecular biology, genetic sequencing. Evolutionary theory has become much more sort of complex and subtle. And imagine at the time, Darwin had none of this, right? He didn't have DNA. He did not have the kinds of microscopes that we have now. All he looked at was fossil data, ontogeny, geographical distribution of species, geological evidence, and this is all he had. And yet he still came up with this remarkably robust theory of evolution based purely on physical evidence. So very little theorizing until that physical evidence was irrefutable. And that is how Darwin essentially came up with his idea. Now, abiogenesis, again, this is the beginning of life itself, not in the origins of species. So we don't know DNA. We don't know where DNA comes from. And that is, again, sort of the field of abiogenesis, which is how the DNA that is what we are made up of as Homo sapiens, where that comes from. And so there could have been some chemical reaction that occurred. We don't know exactly what happened. We have lots of theories. The Big Bang Theory is one of them. But whatever chemical reaction that started this whole process, we don't know. We have religious explanations. We have some philosophical explanations. But the scientific ones are more in the realm of theoretical physics, right? Because we weren't there. That Big Bang is just a possibility based on an awful lot of evidence, right? Factual evidence that we are always looking to confirm and reconfirm. So that chemical reaction that started this whole thing, we're not 100% sure on it. We can only make sort of hypothetical claims. So heritability, mutation, selection, these things we can prove, we can see, but the chemical reaction that started this whole thing, that's the part we don't know, because that is abiogenesis. And now we're moving into something that is much more difficult to prove with the facts, right, that we have, the evidence that we have. Now, when we try to at least figure out the chemical interaction that's going on, the autocatalyzing reaction of amino acids is one that is fairly consistent and certainly points us in the right direction. And again, autocatalytic reactions, A leads to B, B leads to C, C creates more of A, and there's a chain that is started up. And again, there's another link here, catalysis to RNA world. This is some pure science, so have a look at it. Again, this won't be on the test, but certainly have a look at it because it is interesting. But there is a certainly a powerful theoretical component to this. It is science, but it's almost pure science or theoretical science. So this is where we are now, and this was thanks to Darwin's remarkable discovery of the theory of evolution. So now we're going to switch gears. We're going to move ahead. Well, it's 1880s now. Freud was alive during the second half of Darwin's life, and then we're going to segue into the 20th century. Freud died in 1939 from throat cancer. But Freud is the gentleman who, like Darwin, turned known assumptions literally on their heads. Now, this is very much a thumbnail sketch of sort of general ideas about Freud. If you're lucky, like me, I was able to take a year-long course looking at Freud's writings. There's a wonderful series put out by Penguin, Penguin, the Pelican Library specifically, lots of birds there. And there's about 14 volumes. We went through every single book. It was fascinating stuff. But we're just going to kind of, I will give you some highlights here. So the most important idea that Freud presents to us in this particular context of philosophical discussions and this continual search for reality is the discovery of the unconscious. And that explosive idea is the one that turns the notion of human rationality literally upside down. And it does it in the following way, because now all of a sudden that unconscious part of our brain that is maybe not, of course, conscious, but influencing the way in which we think, our motivations, our ideas, these things are at work all the time. And it's only after that we can go back and look and go, why did I do this? Or why did I say that? It doesn't make sense. It was irrational. But when you start looking at your motivations, you start realizing that, okay, earlier that day I was thinking about the following, and I kind of buried it and I didn't think about it anymore. Well, sure enough, at a moment when it was probably the worst time to think about it, boop, there it was, right? It popped out and it was sublimated, right? Channeled into something else. So Freud presents to us this theory of the unconscious as this source of drives and desires that are usually sort of kept a lid on, but that lid, it doesn't work well all the time, and things will occasionally sort of slip out. And what Freud does is he tries to map this unconscious and tries to explain how it works. And it's still a pretty fascinating idea, despite the fact that in grad school, one of my sociology professors said, I don't believe in the unconscious. Okay, so there are some people, just like they don't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution, some people who don't believe in Freud's theory of the unconscious, because it is a theory. I mean, our brain is not physically divided up in these parts, but Freud did identify a part of our psyche, because that's essentially what he's talking about, that was unconscious. It lays buried underneath, and lots of things that we have experienced often get parked in there, right? They get cataloged in there, but it's the way in which we do it. If it's something very traumatic, it doesn't get buried in there very well. because of the fact that it's traumatic. So we need to remember what it is we're trying to store in there, and we have to be able to deal with something and deal with it well and to a degree of satisfaction that will not come back to haunt us. Because when it does come back to haunt us, it's coming from the unconscious. And quite often when we dream, we're dreaming about things that were buried in our unconscious during the day or over the last few days that pop out. And these are unrealized goals or things that need to be dealt with, sort of things that sort of, caught your attention at a moment during the day, and then you just stop thinking about it. Well, at 3 o'clock in the morning, there it is. It comes back, and here you are thinking about it and not sleeping. So the unconscious is there, and it is a place where these kinds of ideas are stored, but sometimes they also get transformed into desires, like a desire to harm someone. These things become much more dangerous because now you've got to figure out a way to contain that, right? To hold that in. So the way in which Freud looks at the containing, right, of these drives and impulses is through what he calls sublimation. And so what is sublimation? It's a process, right? It's a mental process where unacceptable impulses, like a desire to kill someone or a desire to harm someone, if it's an unconscious or even a conscious drive, but let's say that impulse is unacceptable, or at least socially unacceptable, it has to be transformed into something that is socially acceptable. And so you could sublimate a desire to harm someone into sports, right? Become a hockey player. You can become, I'm part of the goon squad. I'm the master body checker. Or football, right? I'm going to be a tackler. I'm going to tackle everybody. Or a boxer, because these are socially acceptable forms of aggressive behavior. Where they're not aggressive is when people just randomly start punching others or physically attacking others because it's not right, and thankfully it's illegal. But it's not illegal to punch someone out for 15 rounds in a boxing ring. And in fact, the person who lasts the longest usually walks away with a huge amount of money, and people pay lots of money to watch it. So it takes sublimation, takes a socially unacceptable impulse like wishing to harm someone, and allows you to sublimate it, right? To transform it into something else that is socially acceptable. And if your mind works well, and you can sublimate these impulses well, then you tend to be a fairly mentally healthy person. When there's a problem, when mental illness starts to appear, is when these tendencies, right, these unacceptable impulses cannot be sublimated. They cannot be channeled properly, right? They cannot be diffused and siphoned off into something that is acceptable. And so what happens is there's a kind of regression, almost to a childlike state, to try to hold this thing in, because every ounce of your psychic energy is devoted to holding this thing in. Meanwhile, everything else is falling apart. So the degree to which you try to suppress these feelings, if you cannot sublimate it properly or just well, will result in issues of mental illness. Now, the issue now with Freud is you need to go to talk to a therapist and figure out a strategy, right? How to turn that unconscious impulse that is now really becoming a problem into something that is correct or socially acceptable. So Freud had this idea in mind of the mind, no pun intended here. Freud had this kind of schema, right? This kind of scientific model that he had of the mind being divided up into three different parts. Now, the id we've already talked about, the unconscious, and the id is a part of the brain that seeks satisfaction, right? This is the source of our sometimes primitive desires, our impulses, right? Our needs. Some can be sublimated, some not so well, but they all come from the id. And these are all these sort of unsatisfied desires that now we need to deal with. And as we mature and we sort of develop language and social skills, and we become aware, sort of even unconsciously at this point, of morality and ethical behavior, what is happening now is a new part of the brain, a new part of the mind is forming called the ego. And the ego is based on realistic expectations of oneself, right? And it starts to organize and catalog and sublimate some of these desires into socially acceptable forms of behavior. And the ego, right? It is guided by the surrounding reality, what Freud calls the reality principle. So it is kind of the one half of the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle, of course, is what the id would be all about. The reality principle, the realistic, everyday world of social mores and moral and ethical behavior. The ego always moves in that direction, right? It tries to move down that particular path. And whatever it does, it wishes to be socially acceptable and morally and ethically right. And in and of itself, it could be pleasurable, because if you are that way, you get friends, you get a job, people like you. But if you are an obnoxious person that is impulsive, chances are you may have a few friends that want to be around you because they like the entertainment, because you will fly off the handle. But it doesn't make for a very consistent type of personality. So you have the id, which is a source of these drives and desires, the ego that grows out of it over time and is more sort of in tune with the realistic world that you and I live in, and tries to channel these id-like desires into something that is socially acceptable. And as we move on and we start becoming more and more aware of our surroundings and our relationships with people, then we start to develop what's called the superego. And that is the morality, right? The knowledge that certain things are right and other things are wrong, legally, morally, or ethically, and so on. And so you take on the morality of the community that you're in when you develop your superego. In French, for example, ego and superego translates to ego as moi and superego as sur moi. So the me and the upon me. So the superego kind of sort of stands over top and just kind of really controls the ego, which in turn tries to control the id. So there is always an interaction between these three sort of parts of the mind. Now, again, I want to stress that these are not actual parts of the brain, but this is the mind. And again, a mind is an idea almost. So Freud talks about how this idea is broken down in these three parts. So we cannot say specifically, I mean, we talk about the frontal cortex and various parts of the brain, believing this is where some of these ideas may coexist. And that's perfectly fine. But at least for now, we're not moving into a scientific direction. We're just talking about Freud and his ability to give us the tools to look at the world more realistically, but also our role in it, right? Our notion of self. So in the same way as we can sublimate some ideas that are coming out of the id, these certain desires, then we also have something called repression. And repression is something that's the lid, right? That's the lid that holds down some of these drives and desires that come out of the id. And so we do this all the time. As much as we would like to say something to someone, we know that we know better, so we repress that thought, and we may do that because our superego is saying, you shouldn't talk to your parents like that, or you shouldn't talk to your teacher this way, or to a person of authority. If you're religious, your imam, your priest, or whoever it is. So you repress certain ideas. Now that's perfectly fine. This is something that works really well. But when it starts to malfunction is when ideas become really powerful that they just kind of slip by, right? They just pop out somewhere else. So repression is not 100%. It's pretty consistent, but it's not 100%. And sometimes you will have what Freud calls a Freudian slip. And these things are often a slip of the tongue, saying something sort of inappropriate and cheeky when you weren't intending to, and you were so hoping not to say that thing that would be offensive that you say it. And there you go, right? So you were so hoping to repress it that it literally popped out somewhere else. So a Freudian slip, much comedy, a lot of comedy and jokes are based and built around this notion of a Freudian slip, because Freud did have this very interesting idea of the jokes in the relationship to the unconscious. This is in fact one of the name of his books. And it's really fascinating, a study on how humor works this way, that we end up saying one thing and the listener knows we're implying something else. This is where the joke is constructed to kind of mimic the way in which repression sometimes will not allow, or not hold everything down. Something's going to slip out. So we think this way, we speak this way, but repression is something that is common. It's something that a normal person, a mentally healthy person will do. It's when we do it, too much, because now the question becomes, why are you repressing these certain things? This really holding them down. Like, you may need to speak to someone because you're spending an awful lot of psychic energy trying to hold down these ideas. So the last one I want to look at is the Oedipus complex, which, although Gardner doesn't talk about it, it is really important because it's an idea that probably more than anything else with Freud has not aged well. And so we're going to take a look at it very briefly, and then I'd like you to just leave with an idea to worth considering, or that is worth considering. So it's crucial to Freud's theory of psychosexual development, and that is the development of young boys more so than young girls, because with young boys, the notion of the Oedipus complex works out reasonably well, but it doesn't work very well for the development of young girls. And Freud really worked hard to try to come up with an alternate version, some opposite to the Oedipus complex. He didn't do very well. So very briefly, what is the Oedipus complex? It is this idea that a young boy competes with his father for his mother's attention. And it results, right, in this desire to kill the father and marry the mother, right, to be the mother's primary interest. But at the same time, the boy fears the father because the fact that the father has much greater strength than the boy. And according to Freud, the complex is resolved when the boy identifies with the father and in this position of power, and he will also be able to go and find his own mate that he can now love and marry, just like he wanted to with the mother, and internalizes that morality of, this is not someone that I should like to sleep with. This is incestuous. And the beginnings of all of this is the beginnings of morality and the beginnings of the superego. And so if we don't sort of navigate through that well, and again, Freud is iffy on what normality is, that, because with Freud, normal is almost like a void. It's everything that's around it. Everything is some version of it. So he believes that if you fail to navigate through this complex well, you may have some neuroses that are going to come up later on. So that's essentially the sort of the Oedipus complex. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, a couple of things. This is what I'd like you to consider. The full story of the Oedipus complex is more than that. The story by Sophocles it starts with a warning by a visionary, a prophet in ancient Athens, to the king that his son is going to grow up and kill him. So what does the king do? The king, when his boy is born, takes him out to the mountainside and leaves him there to kill him first. First part, Freud forgot that. So the king tries to kill the boy first. The boy is picked up by a shepherd who nurtures him and takes care of him, and he grows up to be a young man. So the young man is just traveling down the road one day, and he's at a crossroad, and the other person at the crossroad is the king. And they don't know who the other person is, right? And this is something else that Freud leaves out. They don't know who each one of them is. So Oedipus doesn't know that the king is the one that's getting in the way. So they get into an argument, and they have a sword fight, and he kills the king. Now again, remember, Oedipus does not know that he has just killed his father, right? And then the father was the king. So he carries on, and he gets to a town, and the town is undergoing this plague. And the only way to cure the people that are there is to answer a riddle. And if you do that, not only will the plague be lifted, because this is what the gods have done, right? The plague will be lifted, and for a consolation prize, you get to marry the queen. So Oedipus says, fine. What's the riddle? All right. The riddle is this. What walks on 4 legs, then on 2 legs, and then finally on 3 legs? Oedipus thinks, man, human beings. We crawl around on all 4s. We finally learn to walk. And then during old age, we walk with a cane. Oh my God, fantastic. And the plague is gone. And here you go. You can marry the queen. Okay, fantastic. It's just kind of cute. They get married. Again, remember, Oedipus does not know who this person is. He does not know that she is his mother. And what happens when Oedipus finally realizes what has occurred, he gouges out his eyes. He harms himself. So, why am I telling you all this? First of all, because it's a really important story from the ancient past, but I wanted to include all these other elements that Freud selectively takes out, right? The fact that the king wished to kill the son first, that's the first part. Secondly, that Oedipus, the boy, does not know he's killed the king, who happens to be his father. And third, he doesn't realize that the woman he's married, who is the queen of this town, is also his mother. But when he does find out, he is so horrified that he blinds himself. He gouges out his own eyes. So even Oedipus was not suffering from the Oedipal complex. He was so horrified at what he did. So those things I want you to be mindful of. The other thing, which is, I think, more important, is think of Freud living at the time he was, at the beginning of the previous century. He made it through the First World War, but there was rampant anti-Semitism in Western Europe, especially in Vienna, where he was living. And so here he is, he's starting this new field, right, called psychoanalysis. And he is interviewing young women who talk about being attacked, and Freud is listening to this. And essentially what he discovered was molestation, sexual assault by uncles and brothers and fathers of these young women. So it was sexual assault by the fathers, by the uncles, and by all the other male figures in that young woman's family, and the trauma she was suffering as a result of it. Wow. Okay, so what does Freud do? He's a Jew living in Vienna, surrounded by anti-Semites. So in other words, it's very difficult to get work, to be recognized. And Freud now he's got to do something. He's discovering this, and he knows this is happening. And he's also trying to legitimize this brand new field called psychoanalysis, where people are now going to be cured of their traumatic events. But the traumatic events are actually happening. And the Victorian family, or at least the Viennese family, is responsible for these horrible things. What does he do? Freud finally says, okay, the only way I can do this is to turn around and say that these were dreams, these were fantasies that these young women had. Because otherwise, can you imagine if he had said, oh, by the way, the reason why these women are neurotic is because they've been sexually assaulted by their own fathers. There is no way that the field of psychoanalysis would have lasted one more day. We would have never heard of Freud. And instead, he had to almost necessarily sacrifice these stories that these young women were telling him and transform them into dreams and fantasies in order for people to even understand what psychoanalysis was about. So if the Oedipus complex sounds a little bizarre, that may be one of the reasons. Think of the Oedipus complex as a kind of hypothesis that was built around this actual event. And so we kind of look through that hypothesis into the event. It's something I'd like you to consider, because I feel very strongly about psychoanalysis. I think it is very valuable, but I also would like to acknowledge the incredible sacrifice that Freud had to make, knowing what was going on in Vienna, where he was studying, where he was trying to start this new field, and yet knowing full well that if he told the truth, he'd be done. he would be ostracized, he would be run out of town, and psychoanalysis would not exist. We would not even know who Freud ever was. And yes, it is a huge sacrifice that he made. I mean, more so the young women that came to see him rather than himself, but it was a necessary sacrifice in order for this field to continue to exist in its present state. So just keep that in mind. All right, so that's it, about an hour and 10 minutes. This is basically the end of Darwin and Freud, two thinkers coming from very different fields. The sciences, we'll say, the natural sciences, and then whether it's Darwin or Freud, but each of them in their own way presented ideas that utterly turned the world upside down. And the repercussions of these ideas still resonate today. And they will when we talk about postmodernism next week, where basically everything is relative. And this is one of the main issues with postmodernism. So we'll look at that next week. I'm not going to start the final quiz until the beginning of next week as well. And there'll be a couple of questions on this module, as well as the one for next week on postmodernism and the construction of gender. In the meantime, take care, and we'll see each other very soon. Bye.